In this lesson, we'll look at how to add and modify transitions to clips in your projects. Transitions are visual conventions by which shots or scenes are juxtaposed. The most common transition is a straight cut, but others, like dissolves and wipes, convey the passage of time, a mood, or serve to separate parts of the story. You'll also learn how to apply and animate effects to alter the look of your video. Before we apply a transition, we need to look at the way Final Cut Pro handles the overlap between clips. Press Command comma to call up the Preferences window and select the Editing button, if it's not selected already. At the bottom of the window is a pop-up menu for controlling how the transitions will be applied. There are two choices, Full Overlap and Available Media. Because the Full Overlap option is new in Final Cut Pro 10, let me briefly discuss how it works. Let's say you had two clips you wanted to apply a 1-second transition between. To keep the discussion simple, let's say that both clips were 5 seconds in duration for a combined total of 10 seconds. When you apply a 1-second transition to the edit point, the overlap is created using 1 second of media from the head of the incoming clip. Both clips retain their 5-second durations. However, the total project duration is shortened by 1 second. The reason for this is to ensure that the transition will always be applied. In legacy versions of Final Cut Pro, there were certain situations that prevented a transition from being applied, namely the lack of available overlap media on either side of the transition. With full overlap selected, you'll never have to worry about lack of media because the overlap is always drawn from the incoming clip. The downside is your project will be shortened by the amount equal to the duration of the transition. With available media chosen, Final Cut Pro will use whatever media is available on either side of the edit point to create the overlap. The upside is your total project duration will not change. The downside is you may end up with a transition that's much shorter than you intended, or in some instances, a transition that cannot be applied at all. In legacy versions of Final Cut Pro, this was the only option available to you, and you always had to be mindful of how much available media you had on either side of the edit point before you applied the transition. For now, let's select Full Overlap and close the window. In the timeline, select the edit point between Confederate Charge 2 and the Motley Crew. Move your playhead to the end of the last clip and make a mental note of the project duration. From the Edit menu, choose Add Cross Dissolve or press Command T. A 1-second transition is added to the edit point, but more importantly, the total project duration is shortened by 1 second, as indicated by the gap between the end of the last clip and the playhead position. As I mentioned, choosing Full Overlap in Preferences always shortens the total project duration by the amount equal to the transition duration being applied. Let's undo that last step, then call up Preferences by pressing Command comma. Change the transition application pop-up to Available Media and close the window. In the timeline, select the same edit point, move the playhead to the end of the last clip, then press Command T. Notice this time the 1-second transition is applied to the edit point, but the project duration does not change as indicated by the final clip remaining at the current playhead position. Personally, being a Final Cut Pro user since version 1, this is the transition behavior I'm used to, so I like to keep my preferences set for available media rather than full overlap. In iMovie, full overlap is the default behavior, but with a different name. Nevertheless, if you're an iMovie user learning Final Cut Pro 10, full overlap is most likely the transition behavior you're most familiar with. Now that we got that gobbledygook out of the way, we can focus our attention on the transition itself. Move your playhead before the transition to play it back. The default transition is always a 1-second cross dissolve. To make working with the transition easier, let's zoom in on it a bit. If you move your mouse over the edge of the transition, you'll see trim icons. Dragging left or right will dynamically change its duration, and a tooltip will appear to show you how many frames you're adding or subtracting from the original duration. If you want to numerically change the transition duration, select the transition and press Ctrl D. Using the entry pad on your keyboard, enter 20 for 20 frames and press Return. You can also perform a rolling edit under a transition. If you move your mouse pointer over the inward-facing triangles at the top of the transition, your cursor will become a trim icon. Click and hold and a 2-up image will appear in the viewer. You'll recall from the lesson on trimming that a 2-up display will only appear in the viewer if you have Show Detailed Trimming Feedback selected in the editing preferences. A rolling icon is a 2-sided trim, which is to say that the outgoing clip's tail frame and the incoming clip's head frame will be trimmed simultaneously. Drag to the left while watching the image in the right frame. When the advancing gray-clad soldier is just about to cross in front of the tree, release your mouse. While many editors prefer cuts and the occasional dissolve, there are times when you need a transition with a bit more bling. To show the media browser, press Command 5, then click the Transitions button in the toolbar to reveal a window of transition thumbnails. Use the scroll feature on your mouse to look through an incredible assortment of transitions. To get a quick preview, skim over the thumbnail to see an animated representation of it in the viewer. There's also a search field at the bottom of the browser and a small button with an arrow to reveal the transition categories. Each of these categories are grouped around specific themes. I'll let you explore these on your own. For now, select the Wipes category. There are a few ways to apply a transition to an edit point. In the timeline, locate the edit point between the Motley Crue and Bob Interview 02. Drag the wipe over the edit point. The transition graphic appears over the edit point with a green plus button. When you see these two visuals, release your mouse. Let's look at another way to apply a transition. Select the out point of the Bob interview. Select the opacity category, then double-click the Fade to Color transition to apply it to the end of the clip. Play back the clip to see it with both transitions applied.
I try to tell true, authentic stories.
Each transition has its own properties that can be adjusted. Select the wipe transition. In the viewer, you'll see a graphic over the image. This graphic is actually a new Final Cut Pro interface convention that allows you to make changes to the transition directly in the viewer. The black arrow indicates the wipe direction, and the small gray diamond is used for controlling the edge softness. The further you drag outward on the diamond, the softer the edge becomes, and vice versa. Dragging the arrow lets you change the wipe direction. These viewer controls are actually a subset of a larger set of controls found in the Transition Inspector. Press Command 4 to reveal the inspector. At the top of the inspector, you'll see the wipe name and its associated property controls. Depending on the transition you've selected, these controls will vary. Starting with the pop-up menu for wipe direction, you can choose from a list of preset directions. You can control the angle of the wipe and the edge treatment. From the Edge Type pop-up, choose Solid Color. Then drag the border slider to change its width. Change the color of the border by clicking on the down-facing arrow and drag over the color field to dynamically view your color selections in the viewer. To reset the properties, click the hooked arrow. Because you'll often be adding a transition to clips with sound, we need to look at how Final Cut Pro deals with audio. In our present example, the Motley Crue clip does not have any audio, but the Bob Interview 02 clip does. Command-click to select both clips, then press Option S to solo. Play the transition and listen carefully.
I try to tell true.
Because transitions always use overlap media, we hear some of Bob's unwanted dialogue during the transition. This is because 12 additional frames of Bob's interview is being used at the head of the clip to create the overlap. Select the transition and look in the inspector, and you'll notice that Final Cut Pro automatically creates audio crossfades under the transition. Fade in type deals with the incoming clip's audio, and fade out type deals with the outgoing clip's audio. By default, a plus 3 dB gain is applied to the audio overlap to keep the sound levels consistent through the crossfade. Clicking the pop-up reveals other fade types you can apply to the audio. While these options will work well when transitioning from natural or background sound, none of these options will work if you have tightly edited dialogue you are transitioning to or from. Therefore, you'll need another solution. With this particular transition, we need to trim the audio. Double-click on the audio waveform to reveal the audio. Move the playhead to the center of the transition. With snapping turned on, drag the in point of the audio until it snaps to the playhead. Play the edit with the transition to hear the change.
I try to tell true.
When you're finished, double-click the waveform to hide the audio and turn soloing off. Now let's replace this transition with another one. Select the Lights category. These transitions were created using Apple's Motion. Drag the bloom transition out of the media browser and drop it onto the wipe transition. When you see the transition turn white, release your mouse. When you replace one transition with another, Final Cut Pro honors the pre-existing transition's duration. Because this transition is computationally intensive, you may observe that the playback stutters a bit. In order to see smooth playback, you'll need to render the transition. Select the transition, then from the Modify menu choose Render Selection or press Ctrl R. Play the transition back, and it should play back at the full frame rate.
I try to tell.
You can also apply more than one transition at a time. Press Home to move the playhead to the start of the project. Select the Drills clip, then press Command-T to apply the default cross dissolve to the head and tail of the clip. Play back the clip to see the result.
1, 1, 2, 1.
We win 90% of the battle.
The second dissolve is a tad too long. Select it, then press Ctrl-D and enter a duration of 12 frames and press Return. If you want, experiment with some of the cross-dissolve types from the pop-up menu in the inspector. I've always been partial to the additive dissolve.